Okay, so now we're calculating overtime with the gross pay. Okay, in the previous example, we just only focused only on the overtime hours. Okay, but this time we're also going to include the total hours the worker worked for. All right. So there are three ways to calculate this gross pay with the overtime. Okay. The first way, you can get the total basic pay. All right. Where you get the total hours, including the overtime hours. Okay. The normal hours they worked plus the overtime hours, you get the total hours and you multiply it by the normal rate. Then you get the overtime premium. Same way we're getting overtime premium earlier on. This is the same way. Overtime hours times the overtime rate times the normal rate. Okay. So here, the main purpose of this method is just separating the regular portion of the work and the overtime premium. So let me show you an example with this first method. Okay. So we've given this information about the work. The normal rate is 100 kwacha per hour. The normal hours that they've worked, they have to work for 40 hours. Now this work, he worked for a total of 45 hours, okay? 40 hours plus overtime, 5 hours, okay? So in total, this worker worked for 45 hours. So now the overtime rate, it's been given time and a half. So we have to find what is the gross pay, okay? So in order to get the gross pay using this method here, all right, is we first get the basic pay, which is the total hours worked, so he worked a total of 45 hours, okay? Because these total hours are also including the overtime hours. So he worked a total of 45 hours, all right? What is the normal rate? He gets paid 100 kwacha per hour. So the basic pay, 45 times 100, 4,500. Okay. Then our overtime premium, the overtime hours, times the overtime rate times the normal rate. Okay, so overtime hours, 5 hours times half, right, times the normal rate, which is 10 kwacha. 100 kwacha. Okay. So five times half, that's 2.5. 2.5 times 100, 250. All right. So the gross pay, okay, what this worker should be paid, 4,500 plus 250, 4,750. Okay, this is like the shortcut method. Okay, we are trying to tabulate gross pay. All right. Any questions before I use the second method? Okay, now we're going to use the second method. We're still tabulating the gross pay for this worker, but here's the second method. We can get it. All right. Now with this method here, with the difference with that other method there is for the basic pay, you're only just going to focus only on the normal hours. Okay, you won't include also the overtime hours. Here you just only focus on the normal hours and the normal rate. Okay, then you get the overtime gross pay basically. Okay, the gross overtime pay, which is which remember this, which we did earlier on. This one here. You're using this formula and you're adding it with the basic pay. So the only difference here is in the basic pay, we haven't included overtime hours. In the previous one, in the basic pay, we included overtime hours. All right. And then we also got the overtime premium. Now here, we're not going to get any overtime premium. We get the overall overtime pay and then the basic pay for the normal hours. Okay. So using the same example here, this worker, normal rate, 100 kwacha per hour, normal hours, 40 hours, they work for 40 hours, overtime hours, 5 hours, the overtime rate, time and a half. Okay, so we calculate the gross pay. So we start first, the basic pay for the normal hours. Okay, so here we're just going to say 40 worked for 40 hours times the normal rate, 100 kwacha per hour, get 4,000 kwacha. Okay, that's the basic pay. Okay, then now we get the overtime pay, the overall overtime pay. Here, the overtime hasn't been broken down into its components. Okay, here you're just getting the overall overtime pay. Okay, so it's the overtime hours times the overtime multiplier times the normal rate. Okay, so the overtime hours, 5 hours. Overtime multiplier, 1.5. The normal rate, 100 kwacha. 5 times 1.5, you get 7.5. 7.5 times 100 kwacha, you get 750. So 4,000 plus 750, 4,750. Okay, this is the gross pay. All right. So unlike the first method, here you won't be able to see the overtime premium because you're getting the overall overtime pay. All right. And then for the normal hours, for the basic pay for the normal hours, you do not include the overtime hours. In the first one, here we included the overtime hours here in the basic pay. And we got the overtime premium. Okay. But here, we're only in the basic pay for the normal hours, you only look at the normal hours, you're excluding overtime. Then you get the gross overtime pay. Any questions before we look at the third and the recommended method? Because at least with this third method, you are going to see how your pay has been broken down. Okay. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. It is. It is. The thing about it is this: the way overtime is calculated, they'll include that normal rate for the overtime hours. If you saw earlier here, let me just refer you here earlier on. Okay. When you break down overtime, overtime is broken down into two parts. Okay. The normal pay, where you're just saying, okay, I'm getting my overtime hours times the normal hourly rate. Then you have with the overtime premium, which is like the addition to this amount, to this normal pay, is the addition there. Is that okay, Mr. Austin? Or if you haven't understood, you can still ask. Okay, so the third and the final method. So the reason why I'm showing you all these methods, different books, they might use one of these three methods. So what will happen is if you are only used accustomed to one method, you'll start getting confused. Now this book is saying this other book is saying this. You get confused. Okay. So I want you to know all three methods so that should you see a different approach in another book, you'll be able to tell, okay, this was the other they used this method or this other. Okay, then this is the final method, the third method. All right. Here, basically, it's breaking down the pay into all your overall your gross pay into different compartments, basically, right? First, you get the normal pay, the normal hours with your normal rate. Okay. Then your overtime, you're going to break it down. Okay. In the first and second method, the first method we only go to the overtime premium. The second method we go to the overall overtime pay. But in this third method, you're going to break the overtime into its components: the basic pay for the overtime and the premium pay of the overtime. Okay. And this one is, I would say, this one is the best amongst the three. So we still use this same example here. Okay, we need to calculate the gross pay for this work. Okay, so we start. First, we get the basic pay for the normal hours. Okay, he worked 40 hours. Okay, he worked for 45 hours, but since the standard number of hours is 40 hours, so first you say, okay, for the 40 hours he worked, the normal 40 hours he worked, we can say 40 times the normal rate, 100, get 4,000. Next, we get the basic pay for the overtime. The overtime hours times the normal rate. All right, so the overtime hours, 5 hours times the normal rate, 100 kwacha. That is 500 kwacha. Okay, that's the basic pay for overtime. Okay, then now we get the overtime premium. Overtime hours times the overtime rate times the normal rate. Okay. So notice whenever you're breaking overtime into its components, when they say time and a half, don't use 1.5 because when you use 1.5, you're going to that's for the overtime pay. Okay. Now for the premium, we're only concentrating on the zero 0.5, which is represented by this half here. So overtime hours, 5 hours times half times 100. Okay. So 5 times half, 2.5. 2.5 times 100, 250. Okay. 4,000 plus 500, 4,500 plus 250, 4,750. Okay. So this is the third method, where the more detailed method, all right? Where you first get the basic pay for the normal hours, basic pay for overtime, then the overtime premium. All right? That is this method, the third method. Then a recap of the second method. With the second method, you're just getting the basic pay for the normal hours and the overall overtime pay. You think of the gross overtime pay. You are not breaking down the overtime into its the basic pay for overtime and the overtime premium. No, you're just getting the overall overtime. Okay, that's the second method. Then the first method, all right, you're getting the basic pay, which includes the total hours worked. Okay, you're combining the overtime and the normal hours. Okay, and then you're also getting the overtime premium. Okay, yes.